The Colditz Story wasn't just Guy Hamilton's most underestimated film, it was a £136,000 independent production that nearly capsized British Lion films and made him a director the industry couldn't ignore. We are digging into the wreckage of the Colditz Story with 10 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside union grievances, legal filings, and out-of-print memoirs. Guy Hamilton didn't choose the Colditz Story, it chose him. The project was originally developed by producer Ivan Foxwell, who had secured the rights to Pat Reed's 1952 memoir, eponymously titled after a Revolutionary War maxim attributed to John Paul Jones. The book's very title was a marketing department's nightmare. It carried, as one internal coverage memo put it, an abstract quality unsuitable for broad audience identification. They wanted something that announced Pacific War immediately and unambiguously, something that played to the same audience that made The Longest Day a blockbuster without requiring a history lesson. Hamilton, fresh off the success of An Inspector Calls, refused to budge. The title he fought to keep became the one thing nobody disputed once the film was released. But the real problem was that the title was the least contentious battle anyone would fight over the next 2 years. By 1953, An Inspector Calls had performed respectably but not spectacularly. The Intruder had earned notices but divided critics and underperformed commercially. 2 consecutive near misses in the language of mid-1950s. British independent cinema constituted a pattern, and patterns have careers. As Hamilton confided to colleagues, documented in later interviews, the Colditz Story had to announce itself as a major British film or confirm what his detractors were already whispering. That Guy Hamilton had crested as a director of confrontational independence, his studio identity had curdled into self-indulgence. Every budget fight, every standoff with the National Film Finance Corporation that followed was made in the shadow of that existential pressure. The studio was surviving only on public funding from the NFFC, having been bailed out in 1949 with £3 million in loans that the government was already writing off as irrecoverable by the time cameras rolled. This is exactly why what happened next with the casting was not creative instinct. It was desperation wearing the costume of confidence. Attenborough was among the first serious candidates considered for the role of Pat Reed. His response, relayed through his agent during early development, was that he found the character insufficiently examined, a diplomatic way of saying that the Reed role offered a hero's journey without the psychological complexity Attenborough was pursuing in the mid-1950s, when his career as both actor and producer was ascending toward more ambitious terrain. The rejection stung precisely because Attenborough was right, and Hamilton privately knew it. John Mills, who ultimately took the role, brought something Attenborough would never have provided, an almost mythological everyman quality, a presence so culturally loaded that the character's simplicity read as conviction rather than limitation. But the real problem was that Mills was filming the Colditz Story with something nobody on the production knew about. Throughout the Shepperton studio shoot in late 1954, John Mills was plagued by a persistent, worsening cough that cast and crew attributed to his famously heavy smoking. Nobody pushed further. It was not until filming wrapped, Hamilton finished 10 days ahead of schedule, that Mills arranged the medical examination that revealed he had lung cancer. Surgeons subsequently removed his entire left lung and 2 ribs. Hamilton later noted with grim pride that his efficient production schedule had effectively given Mills the time to seek medical attention. The performance on screen, quieter, more restrained than Mills's typical register, now carries a different weight entirely when you understand what was happening inside his body during every single take. This is exactly why the film's quietness, which critics in 1955 read as sluggishness, reads today as something closer to mortality. The casting of Christopher Rhodes as the towering Scottish officer Mac McGill represents one of the production's most documented cruelties. Rhodes, an old Etonian whose natural patrician bearing masked deep insecurity, had already been publicly humiliated by Hamilton during earlier test screenings for An Inspector Calls, sessions where the director reportedly berated him in front of the full crew for what he characterized as insufficient technique, reducing Rhodes to silence in front of hundreds of people. That Rhodes' return for the Colditz Story was a professional decision driven by the size of the role rather than any reconciliation. The pattern repeated on the Shepperton soundstages, documented by multiple crew members as sustained and methodical. Rhodes made very few significant films afterward and eventually abandoned acting entirely for a successful career as an art director. a transition that those who witnessed the Hamilton productions found entirely understandable and not at all surprising. But the real problem was that not every actor on the production accepted this treatment lying down. Dennis Shaw arrived for the Colditz Story having witnessed Hamilton's treatment of Rhodes firsthand. He preempted the dynamic before it could begin. As Shaw recounted in his memoirs, when Hamilton raised his voice on set over a continuity issue, Shaw walked over and said quietly, "Nose to nose. Are you talking to me?" That was the end of it. Hamilton never raised his voice at Shaw again for the duration of the production. In his later writings, Shaw spoke with genuine pride about his performance as the Commandant's second-in-command PM, calling it one of his more psychologically complex roles. A man whose wartime violence is neither excused nor cleanly condemned by the film's moral architecture. The performance Hamilton tried to control became the performance he couldn't. This is exactly why the Priam storyline carries the film's most dangerous argument, and why what happened to that argument next is the production's deepest wound. British Lion's cooperation came with conditions that the film's publicity materials never advertised. Script oversight provisions requiring review and approval of any scene depicting the studio's financial precarity. The NFFC liaison assigned to the production, whose name appears in no official credits, inserted himself into creative discussions well beyond his formal mandate. Production reports held in the government archive document a sustained dispute over the Eddington rape subplot. The NFFC's position was that a film whose debts went unrecovered within the studio's narrative represented an endorsement of fiscal irresponsibility that would reflect badly on the entire state-backed film sector. Hamilton's position was that the audience's discomfort was precisely the point, that the film was about institutional failure to hold powerful financiers accountable. But the real problem was that Hamilton lost this particular fight, and the scar is visible in the finished film. The resolution reached between Hamilton and the NFFC liaison left the studio's insolvency in the record, but constrained how explicitly the government could acknowledge the bailout within the narrative. Crew members present for the production meetings described Hamilton as furious for days afterward. The financial subplot in the final film feels truncated, gesturing toward something it has been prevented from fully depicting. That truncation was not an artistic choice. It was the visible residue of institutional interference applied to the film's most modern and most uncomfortable argument. What remains is still more confrontational than anything else in the British war picture genre of its decade. What was removed would have made the film genuinely dangerous. This is exactly why the black and white cinematography that surrounds this compromised storyline matters more than anyone at the time acknowledged. The Colditz Story belongs to a genealogy it never publicly acknowledged. The structural template, claustrophobic multi-character POW narrative, decent senior officer undone by institutional failure, moral ambiguity of survival, derives overwhelmingly from Carol Reed's 1949 The Third Man. Guy Hamilton, as Reed's assistant director on that film, drew on this tradition so thoroughly that the Reed estate, through informal channels, never a formal legal filing, reportedly communicated displeasure about what one representative characterized as structural and tonal familiarity of early drafts. No action was taken. The debt was never credited. Contemporary audiences watching both films back-to-back will recognize the borrowing immediately. The grammar is identical, the moral universe nearly interchangeable. But the real problem was a more obscure source that no one acknowledged at all. Novelist and former naval officer Nicholas Montserrat, whose depictions of Atlantic convoy culture, the loneliness of escort duty, the bureaucratic cowardice of career-protecting men had been absorbed into Reed's novel and passed largely intact into Hamilton's screenplay, was alive and professionally active during the entire production. His name appears nowhere in the production's acknowledgments. Whether Montserrat was aware of the debt and whether any private communication occurred between his representatives and the studio's legal department remains unresolved in any publicly available historical record. The silence on all sides is its own kind of answer. This is exactly why the film's institutional critique feels both specific and sourceless, because its sources were never paid. Hamilton's screenplay went through 7 documented drafts before a shooting script was finalized, a number that represents not routine refinement, but a genuinely contentious series of interventions involving the director, the studio, the NFFC liaison, and the source material's author simultaneously. Reed, a former Rear Admiral's aide whose investment in naval cultural accuracy was personal testimony rather than professional pride, was not a passive observer of his novel's adaptation. The liberties early drafts took with procedural specificity produced sustained friction, communicated through formal correspondence. A legal inquiry, never formalized into litigation but generating written records, concerned a character whose institutional cowardice Hamilton had condensed into generic villainy over Reed's explicit written objection. Hamilton also fought the British Board of Film Censors over a single line of dialogue, "Screw the captain," and kept it in the final film. That was the one fight he won cleanly. The production was budgeted at £136,000 and went £43,000 over. A modest overrun by the standards of 1950s British cinema, but one that had consequences distributed unevenly across departments. The special effects allocation, which was supposed to fund the POW camp sequences, was progressively consumed by cost overruns in the Shepperton location work and the administrative expenses of NFFC cooperation. The effects supervisor submitted a formal complaint to the production manager documenting the inadequacy of available resources. No additional funds were allocated. What reached the screen was exactly what a depleted budget produces. Scale models that critics in the monthly film bulletin noted looked disturbingly like toys. The miniatures became the primary evidence in the critical case against the film's competence, and the fault lay entirely with budget mismanagement, not craft failure. But the real problem was that the critical conversation about the miniatures drowned out the one genuinely exceptional technical achievement the film contains. Cinematographer Loyal Griggs, Academy Award winner for The Third Man and a nominee again for this film, designed his entire visual approach around a problem the critical conversation never discussed: how to create seamless continuity between original studio photography and archival POW camp footage that was almost entirely black and white. His widescreen compositions using deep focus, the calibration of contrast levels to match the grain and tonal range of documentary material, represent one of the more technically demanding achievements in 1950s British cinematography. The black and white decision that British Lion's marketing division fought against was not aesthetic sentiment. It was a practical solution to a structural problem, executed with extraordinary precision by a craftsman who received his Academy nomination in the mail but was then largely forgotten by the film's historical reputation. This is exactly why the Colditz Story looks different from every other British war film of its era, and why Patricia Neal remembered the production very differently from everyone else. Patricia Neal, cast as the Red Cross officer Lieutenant Virginia Reed, fresh from her Academy Award for HUD, later described Hamilton as the most generous man I ever knew, a statement that landed like a grenade among crew members who had watched him operate on Christopher Rhodes. She revealed that Hamilton had restructured portions of the production schedule around the birth of her child and had invited her family to the Shepperton location at his own personal expense. The contrast between this Hamilton and the Hamilton dismantling Rhodes's confidence on the same production, in the same locations, is one of the more psychologically unresolvable portraits in British cinema memoir literature. He was not one thing, he was several contradictory things operating in parallel, and the film reflects that contradiction in ways no single reading can contain. But the real problem was that the film's most consistent critical wound had nothing to do with Hamilton's personality. Henry Fonda appears as the American POW camp senior officer, and in 1954, a year of political tension in Hollywood, the pairing of Fonda with Mills across the most visible political divide in the British studio system was a statement the production never made explicitly. What the narrative of political Cold War between them obscures is the documented reality. The two men were longtime friends and collaborators whose relationship ran through British National Theatre productions across decades. They had made an explicit pact never to discuss politics in order to preserve the friendship, and they honored it. The tension between their worldviews was real and unresolved. The professional hostility was invented by a press corps that preferred conflict to complexity. Hamilton casting both men was not an act of careful management. It was an act of confidence in the friendship's durability. This is exactly why the film's ensemble holds together despite everything that was pulling it apart. Franchot Tone, Oscar nominated for Mutiny on the Bounty in 1935, a reliable leading man of the studio era, appears as the camp commandant at 59 years old and already diminished by the heavy smoking that would eventually produce the lung cancer killing him by 1968. The performance summons real authority from depleted reserves. It is quietly remarkable under those circumstances. What the production records cannot reflect but history makes visible is the particular irony of two men on the same call sheet, Tone and Mills, moving unknowingly toward identical cancer diagnoses during the same months of filming. Two actors playing warriors, both fighting private battles the camera could not see and the script could not acknowledge. But the real problem was that this private tragedy, invisible during production, mirrors the film's public argument about the hidden costs of institutional loyalty. Francis Chagrin composed the score for the Colditz Story, not yet the household name he would become, but already a composer of remarkable textural sophistication. His work here uses brass-heavy military vocabulary with enough intelligence to distinguish it from the generic, and the title sequence, positioned at the film's conclusion rather than its opening, provided a formal visual counterpart that film scholars have since recognized as a deliberate structural statement. What neither received in 1955 was adequate critical attention because the conversation about the miniatures consumed the column inches that should have gone to the film's genuine formal achievements. The score and the title sequence were treated as peripheral. They were, in fact, the clearest evidence of a director still operating at the height of his formal intelligence. This is exactly why what the critics wrote in 1955 tells you more about critical fashion than about the film. Judith Crist in the Manchester Guardian called it an expensive muddle. Pauline Kael found it competent in a depressing way. The Monthly Film Bulletin argued that "You Can't Kill John Mills" was the only message that came through clearly. All three applied to the Colditz Story, the criteria of the emotionally immersive war picture, the film that generates grief with moral clarity in equal measure, when the film Hamilton had actually made was something structurally different, a procedural examination of institutional failure that happened to be staged against a POW backdrop. The emotional coolness they criticized was, in considerable part, the point. They reviewed the film they expected. They did not review the film they watched. This is exactly why the film's treatment of institutional military cowardice was, in 1955, legible only as a World War II narrative. In the context of Vietnam, the institutional failures documented in post-Vietnam military histories and the persistent pattern of accountability avoidance that characterized British military culture across the following decades, the same material reads as something considerably more searching and uncomfortable. The Eddington subplot, truncated by NFFC interference, criticized as melodramatic excess, now reads as a prescient attempt to hold the war film's celebration of masculine authority accountable to the violence that authority perpetuates. The film was ahead of its cultural moment in ways its moment structurally could not recognize. The vocabulary required to receive it fairly took 30 years to develop. The film that survived production is imperfect. It is also, in its imperfection, more honest than the masterpiece it was supposed to be. Hamilton spent his career fighting institutional power, the BBFC, the studio system, and now the National Film Finance Corporation. The Colditz Story was the fight where the institution won more rounds than he did. He finished 10 days ahead of schedule, may have saved his star's life without knowing it, fought the censors over a single line of dialogue and won, and delivered a film the culture needed 30 years to understand. But here's the question the film leaves embedded in its narrative like an unexploded shell. If the National Film Finance Corporation has required script approval as a condition of government funding since at least the 1940s, and if that approval demonstrably shaped the moral arguments films about British military culture were permitted to make, then how many of the war films you consider great are, in the most precise sense of the word, approved propaganda? And if the answer is most of them, what does that mean for the act of watching them? Leave that in the comments. The argument is the point. If this investigation changed how you see the Colditz Story, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.